Hi, and welcome to another series of the Melissa Roberts Foundation online training modules. My name is Bruce Roberts, and I'm the chair of the Melissa Roberts Foundation. Today we're going to talk about the hearing voices experience. So there are 7 videos that we'll be doing on this particular experience, and today we're talking about the experience so people can get a good understanding of what the voices are all about. What do we mean by hearing voices? Well, initially what we're talking about is someone who experiences hearing voices on a regular, recurring basis. And voices can be sporadic, or in many cases they can present for 24/7 with the particular voice hearer. So everyone's experiences are different. So a lot of people hear the voices all the time, and others hear them from time to time, depending on their situation and where they are in their voice hearing journey. So we look at what the textbook talks us about hearing voices, and it talks about auditory hallucinations or hearing things others cannot. It also talks about being typically a diagnostic feature of psychosis, most commonly diagnosed as schizophrenia, often associated with unusual beliefs, and has come to include other experiences, so seeing or feeling things. So when we talk about hearing voices, it's a generic definition. We have people who hear voices in the narrative, we have people who see visions of their voices, and other sensations that they actually experience. So we cover that all under the gambit of a hearing voices experience. When we look at these particular textbook definitions, we have a fundamental problem with some of them. Initially, we talk about the word hallucinations. Now, what does the word hallucination imply? It implies that this experience of seeing, hearing, feeling, or smelling something that does not exist. Now, we have a fundamental problem with that. And we have a fundamental problem because people who with lived experience of hearing voices have a very real concept of their voice experience. So, voices are not hallucinations. They are very real experiences. Ask any voice hearer whether a voice is real and they will tell you that. And in fact, arguments about whether they're real or not really aren't helpful, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So essentially from our perspective, forget about the word hallucination and talk about the fact that the voices are a real perception for the voice hearer. In fact, we've had some brain imaging studies done over the years which show that the brain's primary auditory cortex reacts in the same way that when I'm talking to you now and you're listening, you've got a receiver in your brain that picks up my voice. It's the same situation for a voice hearer who hears voices. So it's a very real perception. And so the primary auditory cortex is exactly the same as in a normal conversation situation. So it's important that we think about that in the context of being a real experience. And why is that? Well, essentially, if we can try to convince people that the voices are not real, they don't own them. And we've known and we've learned from people with lived experience that owning the voices is a very, very essential component of their recovery journey. They have to accept the fact that they're a voice hearer, and they have to accept the fact that they are able to exercise control over the voices in time. So if we talk about the voices as not being real, in other words, being hallucinations, it basically generates denial. People have this, well, they're not real, you're hearing voices, but they're not really there, so I'm mad. And when you give people that definition, essentially they're not going to disclose. You know, people talk about things like depression, and that's socially acceptable. Start talking about people who experience voices, and they tend to take 2 steps back. It's a stigma that is very hard to avoid, and therefore people are very, very reluctant to disclose the fact that they hear voices, and that's not good for their long-term recovery journey. However, if we talk about the voices as being real, it helps the person to accept the fact that they're a voice hearer. It helps the person actually take ownership of their voices. And therefore, it gives them the opportunity to look at their voices in a strategic way. They can then look at how that they can learn how to live in harmony with the voices. And essentially, that's where we need to be. That's where we need to get voice hearers thinking about their journey and being in control of the voices rather than being controlled by the voices. So when we talk about hearing voices, what do we actually mean? When you talk about a person who cannot cope with their voices as ill, it's understandable when voices and emotions or behaviour they provoke are dominating the person's life. So in other words, the person is being controlled and they are unable to function what we would consider to be normally because of the voices. And it's also reasonable to call the person ill when the voices are not an integrated part of the person but destroy one's free will. Again, not being able to take control of their own personal situation. However, it's not right to look at the hearing voices in itself as a symptom of an illness, often associated with unusual beliefs. It is the coping with that experience that might give rise to the emotions and behaviour that can be called ill. So why are we saying that? Why are we saying it's not right to look at hearing voices across the board as an illness? Well, essentially we know that there are a lot of people in the world who live with their voices and never ever present to a mental health facility. They never have a problem with their voices. So to throw a blanket over all voice hearers and suggest that everybody who hears voices is essentially ill and has some sort of mental health condition is just not correct. It's harmful to identify them as a disease in that regard. In many instances, people's voices are a reaction to problems in life and between people. This is very important. Reactions to problems in life and between people. And when we get down to the core of the problem of people who experience distressing voices, we need to look at their life history. Essentially, peeling back the layers and looking at their life history is the most important part of learning about their voice experience. Somewhere in their journey, there's a correlation between their life history and the onset of the voices, and we have to determine what that is. Voices in themselves may not be the problem, but rather the relationship the voice hearer has with them. So their ability to be able to communicate, their ability to be able to control and have some form of relationship with the voices is the key. If they can't do that, and essentially that's what happens with most people who are highly distressed, they're trying to push the voices away, then they'll basically be in a situation where they'll get no peace. The power they have in their influence in a person's life may be the problem. So voices exercise power. You know, their ability to control a voice hearer is by able to exercise power over the voice hearer, and they do that in many ways. So what's the physical experience of hearing voices? We hear voices inside the head or outside the head, in some cases in other parts of the body. So I'm talking to you now, that's an outside the head experience, like a normal conversation between two people. They also hear them inside the head, which is like a subconscious message in their head. But don't confuse that with an intrusive thought, because intrusive thoughts and hearing voices are two different things. They can be loud or soft. There can be one voice, there can be two, there can be 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 voices. Everyone's experiences are different. They can be people that the voice hearer is aware of or know, but in most cases the voice is not known to the voice hearer, at least in the first instances, until they learn a bit more about their experiences. Voices can be passive and also aggressive. Some people hear both. Some people hear just aggressive voices, other people hear just passive voices, and sometimes the voices talk in different situations. They talk into the third person. For example, Bruce is doing this, Bruce is going over there to do that. Often they also talk about the voice hearer, they don't talk actually to the voice hearer, and that can be very frustrating for a voice hearer when they've got two voices actually talking about them, but not actually talking to the voice hearer. That can be even more frustrating than the first person. So again, they can be clear speech or mumble. We're not always talking about the narrative. A lot of people hear music, they hear chanting, they hear other noises. So we all cover that off in the broad definition of hearing voices. They can be, again, familiar voices, but they also may be associated with other sensory experiences. As I said before, some voice hearers actually see visions of their voices. Other people have feelings of the voices inside their body or on their body. They have tactile sensations, which essentially still come under that broad definition of hearing voices. So it's a very wide definition. So when we look at it in summary, we're saying that hearing voices is a personal experience. Again, everyone's experience is different. And in terms of what the voices say, and very importantly, and the life events and ideals that provoke them. When analysed properly, the relationship between the voices and the life history can show that the voices make sense when looking at the circumstances in life which provoke them. So we have a very clear link between the onset of the voices and life history. And so we need to understand the voices, we need to look at the life history. And that's essentially the essential element of going forward in terms of recovery. Again, everyone's experiences are different, but we do summarise them down into two categories. All voice hearers fall into two categories. Essentially, very simply, those that cope. And I mentioned before that half the people that experience voices almost never present to a mental health service. They are able to cope. and those that don't cope. And essentially there's the people that we see most of, are those people that are what we call stuck in stage 1 of the voice hearing experience, which is called the startling stage, and we'll talk about that in another session. But they essentially in a situation where they find it very difficult to cope. The voices are very tormenting, and they're unable to control them and act their life in a normal fashion. Again, half of all voice hearers cope with their voices. So again, it's not correct to throw a blanket over everybody and suggest that everybody that hears voices has some sort of mental health problem. It's just not true. In our next video, the making sense of the experience, we'll talk more about the types of voice hearers and exactly what all that means. So let's look at some stats on voice hearing. 6 to 10% of people hear voices. And the key statistic here, 80% plus of voice hearers have experienced trauma in their lives. So here we have again this issue where life history and the onset of the voices have a very clear correlation. 80%, and other statistics suggest it's even higher than that, have some form of trauma in their life. And the trauma and the onset of the voices are very often linked. So again, it's about peeling back the layers and looking at the experience, life history, and that starts to help provide some sort of information to give you an explanatory framework for the voices. Hearing voices is a response to life events, nothing more. 6 and 10% of people hear voices, and 80% of them have experienced trauma. I often ask when I train people, is 6 to 10% in most people's expectations high? And most people say, oh, it looks a bit low. And I think, okay. I guess if you look at it in correlation with other more common ailments or conditions, things like cancer, asthma, diabetes, all these other conditions that people live with, which are very, unfortunately, household names and common knowledge to everybody. Unfortunately, voices aren't. But if we look at what those statistics look like, people living with cancer in Australia at the moment, 5% of the population. People living with diabetes in Australia, 5% of the population. People living with asthma in Australia, 11%. So again, these are very, very common, well-known conditions that are in our face all the time, in our everyday life. Yet these numbers are in the same level, or less if you like, as the hearing voices experience. So an experience which we hear very little about. So when you look at 6 to 10%, it's quite high when you consider its relationship with other conditions. When we talk about voices and when we work with people with lived experience of voices, we tend to relate to them in a more human way, in a much more respectful language way. In other words, we try to avoid the mental health definitions, if you like, around these experiences, because we find that it's easier in our relationship with the people. So rather than talk about auditory hallucinations, and we've explained why that is, we don't believe that they're hallucinations. We only prefer to talk about hearing voices. Also, visual hallucinations, again, seeing visions. We don't want to talk about delusions, we want to talk about beliefs. We don't want to talk about symptoms, we want to talk about experiences. And we don't want to talk about illness, we want to talk about distress. So we find that using common language or more respectful language is a much easier way to communicate with people with these experiences. So that's the end of Module 1 about hearing voices. Again, everyone's experiences are different. And it's important that we understand that, but it's also important that we understand that the voices are nothing more than a response to life events, and it's about learning what those life events are and trying to determine the correlation between the two that's very important. In our next module, making sense of the experience, we'll look more at why people hear voices and their relationship with the voices, and try to put some meat around those issues as to why that experience exists. Hopefully none of that has been disturbing, but if you've been disturbed in any way by any of this content, please look at your options. Lifeline here in Australia is an option, 131114. Obviously, or your mental health practitioner, a family member or friend, if you're feeling a bit disturbed after watching this video. If you're in another country, of course, you'll have to look at your own options in that regard. Thanks very much for tuning in on this particular module, and bye for now.